Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burkt and I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. The Preservation Association of Lincoln is sponsoring today's brown bag. Our speaker today is Isaiah Yott. Isaiah is the longtime executive director of the Kregel Windmill Factory Museum in historic Nebraska City, Nebraska. The Kregel Museum is the last original and operational 18th, 19th century farm windmill factory, entirely preserved as it was in the USA. Now a walk-through museum. The Kregel Museum became a National Historic Landmark in 2024. Isaiah is here today to tell you the Kregel family story and how it remains impactful on the ongoing lessons in history of agriculture and American farm history, even today. Please join me in welcoming Isaiah.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon. I am Isaiah Yott, as Eileen said, the executive director of Kregel Windmill Factory Museum, that's a big one, in Nebraska City, Nebraska. And I have been the longtime director there for many years now. But my story in windmills got started when I was about 11 years old out on the farm, much like a lot of young people out here in the Midwest, a very agricultural heavy state, as we all know. So it's the kind of thing where we're going down the road, Dad and Grandpa and I, and I'm a little kid, and we see this windmill over here, and it's kind of all busted up, not working, and I say something like, "Oh, it's broken, Dad. They need to fix it." And he kind of laughs. And what I didn't know is a few months after this, Grandpa and Dad and I were going to buy that same windmill, fix it up, and use it on our property. And that is technically where my story, my history, my beginning in windmills starts as a little kid. Now, over the years, coming from a farm, Midwest ag background, baling hay, mending fence, cutting down volunteers, looking and restoring and finding and collecting windmills just kind of came along with all of that territory. And so as the years passed, much like everybody else does, I ended up at the University of Nebraska of Lincoln, getting a college education in political science and American history. I'm kind of a nerd like that. So then I got into real estate for a while, for some years, did okay, but history was really my passion. Farming and ag and all that stuff, that bubble that's around all that kind of content, that was my passion. And so I ended up going back to school and got a master's in educational administration. And then I needed a job when I graduated. So lo and behold, I think this is where fate stepped in, because I took a full-time executive assistant position at the Kimmel Foundation, which is the Richard P. Kimmel and Lorraine Kimmel Charitable Foundation, the long version, based out of Nebraska City, Nebraska. But I became the, as he would say, right-hand man of the man that ran that charity, and that's about a $30 million charity. They do a lot of substantial work in southeast Nebraska. Very, very lucky to have them in our community. So I'm working for the president of this organization, bonding, becoming friends, doing good, honorable work. And we go to dinner one night and his phone rings. And it's the kind of thing where the previous director of the Kregel Museum is saying, "Well, I had a death in the family. I'm the power of attorney. I got to move back to Michigan. I got to resign. Really sorry." And Ernie looks at me and he goes, "I don't know anybody that knows more about windmills than you, and you're the one that's trained him. So I need you to run the museum." Well, I didn't really know how I felt about that. I was busy. But he had a way with words, and I loved that man. Even though he was my boss, he was my friend and mentor as well. So I accepted the position, and here I am all of these many, many years later as the full-time director of Kregel Museum. So the Kregel story is kind of a fascinating one that most people don't know about. I can't stand up here and say that, like Lewis and Clark or Daniel Boone or Davy Crockett or any of these other Americana names that just come to mind easily for most Americans, the Kregel story is sort of a hidden, fascinating story. But Long story short, it starts in 1879 in Nebraska City. It's George and Louis Kregel, they're cousins. And essentially they are young people. They end up buying a steel plow factory, of all things. And as the years go by, they start to add what we call side action or side businesses related to wood and metal out of their factory or shop. Well, turn of the century rolls around, they need a bigger building, so they end up moving directly across the street from their original factory, and that is actually where my museum, Kregel, sits today. It's right across from City Hall, prime real estate, as they say. So it's the kind of thing from 1902 to 1991, they're operating out of that facility, and they're making Eli windmills. They're also making money 70 different ways related to wood and steel. So 112 years of business, 1879 to 1991, the Kregel family. Then something tragic happens. In 1991, Art, the founder's youngest son, passes away, but he is 93, so he had a good long run, but everybody ends up passing at some point, as we know. That was kind of a devastating blow to the family, and there wasn't exactly any heirs or children to keep the business running. So the building and its contents sat there, doing nothing, as they were, for a couple of years. And in 1993, the nice way of putting it is the community really wanted to save this place. So they got people involved. They took action. They started putting all those little dominoes together to turn this original factory from turn of the century into a brand new museum that you could walk through and learn from. And we have the Kimmel Foundation to thank for that, because it was their first few $1 million that started this endeavor. So when you walk through the door of Kregel, a lot of people don't understand that you're actually standing in two buildings. What you're standing in when you walk in is the original structure, as it was, entirely operational. But the exterior is an entirely new building that we've wrapped around the original to protect it. The thing about 100-plus-year-old items is they tend to decay very quickly, so we have to protect them, building within a building. Now, when you visit the museum, which I would encourage you to do, I offer two kinds of tours. I offer what I call Self-Explore, which is a little bit of me and a little bit of the room and the multiple kiosk stations with interactive videos that we have. Or I give you what you're actually looking at right now in front of the camera, which is a little more of a one-on-one guided personal tour. And FYI, most people like the personal tour more than they like the self-serve tour. It's more informative, just saying. Now, you go through the museum, and the one thing that I stress to people the most when you first walk in the door are the following things. It all works. It's all original. It's not replica. It wasn't brought in. I could make that windmill that you see outside, which is an original piece made inside my walls 127 years ago. But then when you start looking at all of the items, that's when the mini stories start to come into effect. It's the Kregel family and all the little contents and items that tell a story too. So a lot of people say, where's all the windmills at, Isaiah? And I have to point out the couple million items of inventory in the building. Come with me, I'll tell you a story. And by the time people leave, they are actually flabbergasted, because I think they didn't really know what to expect when they walked into a factory full of contents and machinery. But after they learn the cultural subtext of the story behind it, they want more. They want to come back for more. It's easy to spend copious amounts of time in my museum because there's always something to look at. There's always something to learn. But more importantly, it's easy to come back for repeat visits because every time you come back, you learn something different. Part of it is me, part of it is the items, part of it is you'd have to spend weeks in there in order to actually synthesize everything. And I think that's special because a lot of museums, you go and it's great, and maybe you only need 1 or 2 visits. That's not the case at Kregel. There's too much inventory in there for you to see it all in one sighting. So, with all the guests that come in, all the people that I talk to, I always mention that because that is very important to me. You can come a lot of times to my place, I think that's special. Now, I like to give some fun facts about windmills because I think that you will actually learn the knowledge behind them and their importance a little bit more succinctly than if I just rattled off 50,000 units, 1894, nobody cares. But you will care about this. In the 1920s, an Eli windmill made at Kregel would have cost you around $130. In today's money, that's almost $6,000. So when you start to look at what money is 126 years ago versus today's economic factors, you see the lesson. Here's something interesting that I share with my school groups as well. I don't know if anybody's a steak eater in this room or anybody that's watching us online right now. I'm going to guess they are. But it's the kind of thing where if you look at an Angus cow and you don't know a lot about cows and the resources it takes to water them and feed them and raise them and take care of them and vaccinate them, and I mean, you got to throw love in there too. It's kind of lost in translation as far as how much work this actually takes for one cow. So when it relates to windmills with young people and adults alike, I like to give the following data. One cow, one hot day in the middle of summer, 40 to 50 gallons of water one day. So with young kids, I'll say, you got homework. Who drinks milk? And they'll raise their hand, and that's all fun. And I'll say, all right, is it the 1 gallon that you got at home, or maybe it's the half-gallon jug? And everybody has their preference, and I'll say, okay, I want you to save 40 gallons worth of empty milk jugs. 40 1-gallon jugs. Throw them in a pile on the floor over there when you hit 40 and look at them as a visual. One cow, one day, middle of summer. Then you go down the road, and depending on if you're in western Nebraska, there are thousands, tens of thousands of cows. Maybe you're in southeast Nebraska, hundreds to thousands. Doesn't really matter where you go in Nebraska. We're pretty cow heavy anywhere you go if it's in season. But it's the kind of thing where presenting that knowledge to you in that way, you'll remember it. You won't forget it easily. And that's why I do it with young people and adults alike. The other thing to know about the Kregel Windmill factory is exactly what Eileen mentioned before. I spent a lot of years, and I had a lot of help from the community, turning our museum into what we call a National Historic Landmark. And that's a big deal. In the whole country, there's only around 2,600 sites that get this honor and accreditation. The only thing higher than an NHL is a national landmark, and we're talking like the White House or the Washington Monument. We're on par with that now. When you talk with the academic people that run the National Historic Landmark nomination and process, sometimes they speak in an academic language, but when you get down to brass tacks, our place, this windmill factory, now a museum, it impacts and represents something much deeper than just a building that windmills were turned out of. It actually relates to the greater American fabric. Windmills were everywhere in America. Windmills were how you got your glass of water 130, 150 years ago. It might be a water pump that it came through, but odds are it was a windmill that sat over the water pump if you weren't pumping it by hand, the old style. So it's the kind of thing where when you take a tour, one of the things that I point out, you go home, oh, I'm thirsty. You go to the fridge, you grab a bottle of water, maybe you go over to the kitchen sink, you turn it on, you put your glass in. It might have taken you 7, 8 seconds to get some water, and you're drinking it, and it's nice. Back then, you had to walk out of the house. You had to go over to the windmill. Maybe it's on, maybe it's not. Well, turn it on. It's got to spin. Oh, what if the wind's not blowing? That's a whole other story. But it's the kind of thing where a lot of people don't understand that water was a lot harder to get back then because you literally had to work to get it before you could drink it or use it to cook with or use it to bathe or to water your crops or your cattle. Now, something else about windmills that I think is a common misconception in our world right now is farm windmills pump water out of the ground. Wind turbines make electrical power. They're usually 300 foot tall. They're huge. They have 3 big fan blades, and they're white or a grayish tone. Those are not windmills. That's very important to remember. I get a lot of people that come through my door and they say, oh, the new modern windmills. No. Let me sit you down a minute here. Let me give you a little crash course. Apples and oranges, folks. Not the same thing. But to give you context, one of those turbines is a few $1,000,000 a shot. Taxpayer funded, by the way. We own a piece of them. You get a lot of people that say, are the turbines good? Are the turbines bad? Well, I never try to weigh in too directly on that. That's a bit political. Everybody should have an opinion, and they're entitled to it. This is America. But what I will tell you is this. Turbine use in this country, Texas, is leading the charge. It's well over half of their electricity that is turbine power now. Our neighbor, Iowa, next door, is actually a second or a third place contender. It's pushing 38% of their electrical power right now. Our state, beloved Nebraska, we're a little lower on the list. It's a hot button issue in our state, depending on if you live on the west side of the state or if you live in central to the eastern side of the state. More on that later, but the idea is turbines are not windmills. Now, when you look at where windmills are used, I have found them all over the country. Part of my work at Kregel is trying to locate Eli windmills made at our place, clear back then. I call them in the wild, or they're wild ones. They look terrible sometimes. They're rusty, they're kind of mangled up, they're broken. Maybe it's a tower, maybe it's a motor, maybe it's just pieces on the ground next to some old tower, right? But every once in a while you find one that's savable. So I think it was the second or the third year I was at Kregel, I started getting it into my head, save these windmills, need to save these windmills, and put them up back in the community. So I started doing that. The first thing I did was find one. I actually found this one 25 minutes north of town, buried in the countryside. A local family that's been there a long time had it. We had coffee. I offered him some money. I explained to him what I wanted to do, and we made a nice deal. Then I took that windmill and I restored it with a couple other partners. It now sits at the Nebraska State Fairgrounds. It's beautiful. So I thought, well, we ought to do some educational programming with the State Fair. So I created a 10-year partnership with them called the Saving Farm Culture Initiative. But the idea is when you go look at the windmills there that we've put there and other people besides Kregel, we want to do more with windmills, we want to do more with the public, and we want to do more with educational things related to windmills. Sometimes it's easy to look at a windmill and it just spins, and it's nice, and it sits next to a barn. You go ask somebody from a rural background, what's a windmill do? They might not be able to even tell you that it pumps water out of the ground, but they can tell you what it is because it's a symbol. Much like somebody who lives in New York City who's never farmed a day in their life, looking at a barn and telling you that's a farm. There's probably corn behind that, maybe some cows, maybe a windmill. So I do spend a lot of time educating people about the Kregel facility and the Kregel family story, but I also like to think that I give people good educational, practical knowledge on what windmills are, what they're used for then and now, and sort of the cultural context behind them, not just the Kregel story. So the State Fair folks, they were so nice and accommodating, I thought this went well, let's do it again. So I contacted Arbor Lodge and Arbor Day Farms in Nebraska City, and our museum ended up putting a windmill over there in Eli that we restored. We also put signs at the base of it that said, go down the street to Kregel and take the tour. So it was a bit of a marketing ploy, but it's saving history. It's saving that steel. Then it's kind of interesting because we get many thousands of people through our facility every year. We're very blessed for that. And I hope to see all of you watching as well. And we're very affordable. But it's the kind of thing where I got a call a few years ago from another museum out in the Sandhills, the Antelope County Museum in Neely, Nebraska, an area famous for a very substantial water mill back in the day. And the director of that museum, Donna, wonderful lady, she goes, Isaiah, you got to help us. We want a windmill. I won't say no. I won't get off the phone until you help us, not to be rude or anything. And we laughed and laughed and laughed, and I said, all right, I will help you with this. So that actually turned into putting an Eli windmill next to their museum in a community green space that they funded and spent substantial money turning into a nice picnic area. So in the world of windmills, I often make the joke, people probably think I'm crazy, But the thing of it is I think people are crazy for windmills. I know I certainly am. Now, I don't know if we'll keep doing more windmills, probably, but it's the kind of thing where it's in the name of education. It's in the name of history, and it's in the name of our beloved Kregel. It keeps our museum name vibrant out there in the Nebraska public, and through the power of the internet, anybody that wants to watch this all around the country or the world. But what I will say about windmills that people probably think differently about is this. They are not dead. They are not dying. They are a little bit antiquated. They're old world. But they are still pumping water at a volume that you would probably not believe. Let me go back to Texas, for example. There are over 89,647 farm windmills pumping water as we speak, just in that state alone. When you ask cattle ranchers, Nebraska folks, Texans, anybody that raises cows in volume or ranches in volume, they're always going to tell you the same thing when it comes to water. We need it, we need more of it, we need as many sources that we can pull from. It kind of goes back to the 1 cow, 1 day, 40 gallons of water situation. But here's what I want you to remember. Electric water pumps are World War II technology. Most of our water pumping power today comes from that. We call it a sump pump, is another street term. You got solar panel stuff now. There's a lot of new technology out there that we can pull the water out of the ground with using solar power. And it's good technology. I'm not here to sell you on any of it, but it is out there. Then you got the old world farm windmills. And when you ask the best farmers and ranchers out there, the families that have been doing this 100 plus years, it's in their blood. They'll always tell you the same thing. We keep an electric water pump on these two and a couple windmills on these, and we just did these 3 solar, we're going with some modern tech there, but why? Why? Why wouldn't you just do all of them the same way? Because if something breaks, it all breaks at the same time. So if your solar panel breaks, backups, backups, backups. If your sump pump breaks, you got the windmill backup, you got the solar panel backup. Heck, if your windmill breaks, you got all these other backups. But that's why windmills will always be utilized for decades to come, even if they're not heavily manufactured anymore. Now, that kind of leads me into a question I get a lot as a windmill expert. Do they still make windmills? How can I find one? Who do I talk to? I don't know anything about it. And I love those conversations with people because I like to sit down and say, let's have a cup of coffee and I'll get a piece of paper and a pen and I'll write you out some notes. But the bottom line is if you're looking to buy a windmill, Air Motor out of Texas is the last remaining American factory making them. They start in 1888 in Chicago, Illinois. They still make them today. It's kind of funny because in my tour, I mention Air Motor once in a while. But then I say, look at the museum you're standing in, Kregel. They start in 1888. We started in 1879. We're older, but we don't make them anymore. But we're original, operational, everything you see around me. I could. And then you talk with the president of Air Motor, and that's a conversation that blows both of our minds. But I mention that because there is a demand for windmills. Sometimes people come in, they're looking for the tour. Oftentimes, they're looking for a community resource for their farms, for their water pump systems, for windmills. And just know that our facility is happy to try to give you knowledge and answer any questions that we may have. And oftentimes that's me. So just know that because it's the kind of thing where windmills are an older thing, but they're a viable thing. Now, something else to keep in mind as you go through Kregel that I think is important. There's a lot of people in this room today, and there's even more watching us online. But back in the day, 120-something years ago, it was 5 to 6 people that ran this facility. I don't think I could point 5 people out in this room and get them to work on a team-level effort like this Kregel staff did 120-something years ago. And here's the other thing that's fascinating to me. Everybody did everything. So Tuesday, it might be such and such, such and such. Wednesday, turn it, such and such, such and such. It means they were all masters of wood, masters of metal, masters of working the forge, doing some castings or some repairs, or maybe they're pouring a batch of babbitt. Yes, that's right. A lot of people don't know that word. It's like rabbit, but it's spelled with a B as in boy. But Babbitt is actually much like a cake recipe. You mix the ingredients together, you get a finished product. Well, when you mix different metals together, you basically get Babbitt, or, modern term, metal alloy. It's a less frictious metal that when you bathe it in oil, it is perfect for machine parts, tractor parts, and in this case, windmill parts. Ball bearings, you name it. We use Babbitt in a lot of things. But can you imagine 6 people being masters of their craft, running around a building that soon you'll probably visit after this lecture? And when you see it, our place is big, but it's kind of small. When you get in there, you realize it's volume. It's not about looking at the building out from the outside. It's about how the heck did they get 2.75 million items and machinery in here, and it's still all here. It's very well built, and it's a tall building. But it's the kind of thing where I like people to understand, too, that as you're going through Kregel, these guys that worked there, the turnover was low. So it really was a career position. And so I like to point that out because we have teachers, we have doctors, we have nurses, we have everybody from all kinds of backgrounds of their profession and their career. But can you imagine waking up every day and putting your 8 or 9 hours into making windmills? Into making wooden beehive boxes, which was the #2 best-selling product at Kregel Museum back in the day when it was a business? Or planing wood, meaning we go to lumber yards nowadays to get wood. Back in the day, they fed them through a big box machine that would shave them into a rough-looking 2x4. Or back then, they called it planed lumber. Can you imagine how many boards one person would have put through in a 37-year career at Kregel? Sometimes I think about that. I'm nerdy like that. But it was a livelihood. It paid well. But it was a very physical job. Now, you come in the summertime to the museum. I have AC units. You don't see them. It's comfortable in there. But back in the day, it was well over 124 degrees inside that factory. 6 people running around in there, forge in the corner, kicking off all kinds of heat too. Can you imagine working in that? It would not have been pleasant. But these folks did it, and they thrived in it, and it was their livelihood. And I find that fascinating too. Sometimes when I'm talking with young people, I'll line them up, no matter what the age group. And we'll go line up by the forge. And by the forge, there's the original anvil. And I keep a hammer over there. And I'll say, all right, everybody get in a line here, and first person's up. I'll hand them that hammer. And I'll explain that hammer is 120 years old, or 119, depending on the year. And I'll say, I want you to hit that anvil 25 times, count it out for your classmates. And they'll strike it. 1, 2, 3, 23, 24, 25. And I'll say, how'd that feel? And they'll go, oh, that's kind of fun. Do it another 25 times. And they'll do it. One youngster, I got him up to 350. He goes, my arm is jello. I can't move my arm. And I said, welcome to work. 120 years ago, in 100-something degrees, and you're wearing, bib overalls and canvas shirt and pants. You're basically working in a suit full of your own sweat. I don't know if a lot of us could have done that, but our ancestors did. And so sometimes with young people, I like to present knowledge in what I call a fun way, but also historically correct, because I think the lesson will be more impactful. They'll remember stuff like that more than 50,000 units, 1894, nobody cares. That is relevant, and that is what young people want to hear. How does that relate to me now, 100 years ago? And that's how it does. Now, the other thing I would keep in mind is at the museum, we do community events year-round. Most of the time they're free, or if you'd like to make a donation, we will never say no to that. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, so it is tax deductible if you're feeling charitable. And 100% of your money goes to everything we do around the museum. So know that if you're looking to travel to a unique, interesting place in southeast Nebraska, you can't go wrong with Nebraska City. There's always something going on, and my place is in the heart of that, and we're proud to be there. Now, the other thing that I would tell you about the museum, it's the kind of thing where as you're walking through, I like people to ask questions. So if you do visit, don't be shy. I will say that. That's kind of one of the blurbs I give you in the beginning as far as if you don't start asking a few questions, I'll start pulling them out of you. And young kids, they think I'm joking, so they laugh and laugh. And then by the end of the tour, every single one of them is asked a question, and I've given them a quiz. But also know that when you go to Kregel, your expectation is probably not going to be understood until you get ready to leave. Every part of the tour, you learn something new. But it's designed to be built on the back of the next thing. So by the time you leave, you've actually probably learned 50 new things. You don't even realize it until you leave. And that's when you start thinking about the breakdown of what was said to you or how it was said to you. And that's why you learn things like beehives were made at a windmill factory, because people raised their own bees back then. Let's call it 75 to 100 years ago. That was a common thing, very common thing. You go look at newspaper recordings of the day. There's one with George Kregel in like 1926, and he's quoted as saying, I think I made more money on the beehives than I ever did on the windmills. And I love that, because then you go look at the Kregel documents, which are stored at the Nebraska State Historic Society, or History Nebraska. If anybody wanted to view those, there is a program on Fridays. At least, I believe it's still there. It was there last year. It's called Open Archive Day on Fridays. You could walk into the archive room. You could say, hey, I heard about that Kregel factory in Nebraska City, the windmill factory, or I took the tour. Isaiah told me about those records. Hey, whoever. I'd like to see them. And you can. And then what they will do is give you a prospectus, and they'll start bringing you out boxes. And they make you wear the little white gloves, because you are dealing with paperwork that's well over 100 years old. But the fact that you can literally hold the documents that they created in your hand, I've learned so many things just from our own records. The best year at Kregel, out of 112, was 1923. They sold 130 windmills that year. Now, if you lined up 130 windmills outside, yeah, that's a lot, but it's not as much as, say, 500 cars. But here's the point. It took a week to make one. For any people running the math out there, that means they're making roughly 2.67 windmills every week. Well, you can't have half a windmill. Let's round up. That means they were almost making 3 every single week in that single year. They didn't add to the labor force. They didn't extend the work hour. It goes back to the whole 6 people, master craftspeople, truly perfect at what they do. You couldn't find that level of talent in today's world. And if you could, I bet you would pay vast sums of money to get those people in a room to produce a finished product. 100-something years ago, a little more commonplace. So it's kind of interesting when you give all this data to people, adults or young people alike, because half the time or more, they've never really heard about half of what I'm saying. And I like that, because it's not that I'm teaching somebody something they already know. I'm actually, most often of the time, teaching people something they don't know. So I do get a personal joy and happiness from that. Now, for all the ladies out there, no hard feelings. The brains of the operation, according to the records, George Kregel himself, founder and owner, was actually his daughter, Ella. And she is the long-term GM office manager of Kregel. It is because of her we have the records. It is because of her people were paid. It is because of her that the business thrived on the financial sense. George, as he would say most often in his writings, was the owner and the labor. She was the brains of the operation. So I give a shout out to her. It's a very special place that is owed to her, because she sat in that office for well over 50 years running that business. And it is a bit tragic. You learn it in the tour, or now in this case. But she ends up passing away in her chair in the factory. She is the only casualty, if you will, the only true death, unrelated to machinery, in the history of Kregel. Now, it's also kind of interesting, because it seems like the younger the children are, they like their blood. They like their gore. And so I get a lot of questions on, did they ever chop their arm off in here? Did they ever chop their fingers off? And it took me about 2.5 years going through the records, because there's about 130,000 pages spanning 112 years. But I started to find little snippets of information about what we called lost appendages, fingers. The final number, best to my recollection, is 9 fingers were lost, not all at once, over 112 years of this windmill factory business. You know, I try to think about even 1 finger gone. Hope it's not the thumb. But that wouldn't have been good. And they didn't have workers' comp. So, whole different world back then. But it's like I also tell young people, when you're working with something that's sharp and dangerous, pay attention because it's sharp and dangerous. And back then, I think they knew that a lot more. 9 fingers over 112 years sounds like a lot when you first hear it on the intake. When you actually run the math, that's not bad. It's morbid to say, but it's not bad. But they didn't have OSHA back then. And that is a good thing now because it keeps everybody safer. But when I tell that to young people, children, school age, they're shocked. For them, it's somehow, it would have been more, or it would have been like they chopped their arm off. But more importantly, it means they're paying attention. And that's a lot to be said nowadays because the young people's attention span can wander. Now, I also would leave some more knowledge with you as far as windmills are concerned. When you look at our country, America, there were north of 300-something windmill manufacturing businesses in our country at one point. Not now, but at one point. When you go look at for the car collectors out there, for the automobile people, I'm one of them as well. That's another, talk to me after the tour at Kregel. But it's the kind of thing where when you look at the auto manufacturing companies, Chevy, Ford, Dodge, Buick, GM, all these different companies making cars back then, windmills were a little less than that, but not by much. And I find that fascinating because there's a lot of people that are into classic cars, classic vehicles. But then when you look at, there were this many windmill companies doing it back then, each with a name and a story and a plug line and we're better than that person because of this, ours is better running because of that. It actually opens up a much bigger story of windmills, not just the Kregel Museum. And so a lot of people, they encounter that when they go take the tour because they've never encountered that besides a single windmill going down the farm road in their life. And that's when I start to point out that there are other people in my windmill world, if you will, that have been doing it as long or longer than me, mentors of mine, if you will. So there's a great book that everybody should look up if you are into that. It's called A Field Guide to American Windmills. It's a picture book too, so don't worry. But it's the kind of thing where in the windmill world, Dr. T. Lindsay Baker wrote this some years ago. He is probably easily considered the leading expert of windmills in our country. I'm up there. I'm a humble guy. I don't like to brag, but I'm a younger guy. My time will come. But this gentleman has been in windmills for north of 46 years. And he's probably written 20 books on them. So he has been a great teacher and a great friend to windmills and myself. But I tell people that because sometimes they encounter me, they encounter the museum, and they like windmills, and they want to learn more. Well, there's resources out there that are not just us. They're not everywhere, mind you, but it's still alive and well. Now, the other thing that I would point out is, I don't know if we have any collectors in the room, but there are what we call, people called windmillers. And that term, depending on if you talk to a windmiller, is a little bit universal. But a windmiller is someone who collects, restores, or services, or studies, say, from a historical standpoint, heavy farm windmills. So believe it or not, the classic car people that are out there that can tell you every little idiosyncrasy of every little thing, and you're just blown away by their knowledge because it's decades of knowledge and experience. There are windmill people like that. I am one of them. But it usually stems back to how our story started here today. You get started in it at a young age. There probably is a farm connection or a mechanical connection. For me, I don't think it was the farm connection. I think it was that I liked taking stuff apart and putting it back together, and I'd never done that with a windmill. And so when Grandpa and Dad wanted to buy one, fix it up, of course I was in because I was working with my hands and it was tools, and Something about that excited me. It was fascinating. But then I just kind of kept going. So then it became more about trying to find another one, do the same thing. Collect them for a little while, maybe sell a few, and all these years later, here I am. But my story is one part of a windmiller's story. Because there's plenty of people in this world, in this country even, in this state, that collect windmills, and you'd never even know them. The leading guy, there's an effort on his behalf, family and friends, to save his 312-something windmills. Largest collection in the world, and he's a Nebraskan. But that effort got started because this particular gentleman was courteous and kind and was a friend of the Kregel Museum back in the 90s. And so it's like everything else in life. Sometimes you meet these people and these things happen. And then dots start connecting, and before you know it, this guy's got 300-something windmills, about one of every kind ever made, restored. And then you have places like the wonderful Kregel Museum, the last of its kind this side of the world, and it all works. I get begged by people every year. I don't even try to keep count anymore because it breaks my heart. Turn the factory back on, make another Eli in there, tape it all. Well, I'd love to do that. And we could. But when you go walk under our line shaft belt system, which is bison hide, American bison, belting that's in some cases well over 115 years old, I don't want stuff to break. Call me old-fashioned. I like taking people through the museum and explaining, even though we could make it operational, we don't, because we'd like this to be here another 100 years as it was, working. But there's also a fair amount of work that we do in the off-season to take the belts off and make sure everything works and runs correctly. We don't turn the machinery on when you take a tour, but it is the kind of thing where we do tape it. And oftentimes you will find that out there in the world through TV specials or social media. Heck, even right now I'm working on giving our website a little bit of a facelift. As the director of Kregel, I've been a little busy the last few years working with others to turn it into a national historic landmark. Took me 5.5 years, but it got done. But it's the kind of thing where when your place is that unique and it's the last of its kind, and I could look at every single person in this room or every single person behind their TV screen watching this program, guarantee you your ancestors were touched by windmills and trying to get water out in the middle of nowhere at some point in time. It's just the nature of water. People say air, you can't live without it. Very true. Food, you can only go so long without food. It's usually longer than water. But water's right up there. It's vital and it's life-giving. And that's why windmills came into existence. Not to water crops, actually. To water trains. So sometimes people think a farmer invented the windmill. Or some kind of rancher or mechanically inclined person. Mechanically inclined is more accurate to the truth. We have windmills in this country because of the earliest steam trains. They could go so far and then they had to stop, throw water into the boiler, otherwise they would explode, they would overheat. Dangerous. So the people would get off, take a little break, the railroad engineers would have a well with a water pump next to it. Teams of 15 to 20 were common back then. So 15 or 20 guys or people going over there, pumping water, throw it in the train's boiler. Maybe this takes an hour, maybe more. Okay, the engine's cooled down enough. Everybody load back on the train. Down the road we go. Well, we don't actually know who invented the first windmills that showed up along the rail tracks, the train tracks. We just know that it was railroad engineers that invented them. And they were made of wood and scrap metal, and they looked rough, to say the least, but they did the job. But the idea was a wheel that was wind-powered would spin. And there is a mechanism and a motor behind the wheel, pitman rod, things like this, that make a stick, a pump rod, go up and down. And when that pump rod goes up and down, it's the same as if I took a huge syringe, plunged it into the ground, and then pulled that stopper up to suck the water out of the ground. That is a water pump powered by a windmill over the top of it, because that wheel is spinning and that plunger is sucking water out of the ground. If somebody would have explained how a water pump works, at a younger age that way, I really wish they would have, is the takeaway. Because it's one of these things where I can remember being 20-something years old and understanding how a water pump worked, and it took one particular hydrology professor to explain basically a plunger or a syringe system. It put the visual in my mind forever. And that's why I tell you that this way, because you probably see the picture of, and there's the windmill over it. So also know that it's a great tour at Kregel, but I think a little outside of the box. I think it's important to have relevant historical data, but I also think it's important to have an experience when you come and visit my museum. Now, I would say 98% of the time, you're looking at the guy that's there throughout the year as the full-time director. But every once in a while, we do have another gentleman that helps me out. He's on our board of directors. And we're both just very passionate about the museum. But we both agree on one thing, even if the tours are just a little bit different. We want you to have a good time on a museum tour. Not you're bored out of your mind and you can't wait to rush off to the next place because you're bored. So sometimes people say, I never expected this. I can't believe you said the tour like that. That data was astounding. Well, I like to think of it as you had an experience that was educational about windmills, rather than you learned about windmills and were bored out of your mind. Now, with that being said, I would love to take some Q&A, some questions and answers. I love questions. Please don't be shy.
So you say that there are windmillers across the country who have collected large or at least decent amounts of windmills. Considering how large a windmill is and like how much space that would take up, is there an effective and acceptable process to dismantle a windmill to occupy less space in a way where it can be reassembled to its original state?
You are speaking my language. Here's what I mean by this. As you said, there are numerous people. I'm friends with most of them. Throughout the years, it's one of these things where windmillers we don't like to be called niche, even if we are a little bit. We're farmers. We're metal people. We like to take old steel and give new life to it through the process of regalvanizing and parts and things. But to get more back to your question, sir, the thing of it is there's something called a stub tower. On a windmill, first off, what you need to know is that the average height of a windmill can be 20 foot, maybe the size of the height of a building, a small building. But it can go into a 70 or 80 foot range. People always ask me, why is that one really, really tall and that one's like really short? Like I've never seen one that short. Kansas comes to mind in my mind. There's parts of Kansas that have a lot of windmills, and there's parts of Kansas that are flat with said windmills. You don't need height if your ground is flat. You can have a 15-foot tall windmill and the wind's still going to turn that wheel just fine. But the opposite, when it's taller, say 60-foot tower, a lot of that corresponds to that hole in the ground where you're pulling water out of your well. That is probably deeper down. And so it really turns into things like mechanical engineering and pump mechanics, hydrology, science of why it's taller, because of how it pumps and the pressure that every piece and how it does its job, to kind of put the simplistic version. But back to the storage of collectors. So it's usually a half and half process. They have some of their stuff outside on shorter towers to keep it out of stronger winds higher up in the air. We're talking 10 or 15 foot, maybe even 5. Just enough to where you could keep it off the ground, but a person could walk up to it. I love that you asked this question, because when you walk into Kregel, it's a big area, but one of the things that we have on display made by a leading windmiller is a 10-foot diameter wooden windmill wheel. 10 foot. And people will go stand next to it. It's a great selfie spot. And we have a tail there that's about, yay tall, and it's big. It says Kregel, Nebraska City. It's a great place for a photo. But we put it in there, one, to show you size, but two, if you go look at the one through the window outside across the street, which is a steel Eli, that's a 10 as well. People say, no, that wheel looks smaller. No, trick of the eye. It's an optical illusion. So when you're standing next to one at ground level, these things are big. And your average wheel diameter, it's not 10. They made them as small as 6, which I have one in Kregel right now if you do come by. It's an air motor. It's a little baby windmill, as me and my daughter call it that. But they made them as big as 30 or 40 foot in diameter. So to give a visual to it, when we're in Kregel with the wooden 10-footer straight across in diameter, I'll say, could you imagine 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, to do a 40-footer? It would explode out of the roof. It would be huge. And those are what we call railroad mills or power mills. Whole other conversation within windmills, whole other subsect. But the idea is the bigger the machine, the more volume it was pumping. So with people that collect windmills, they usually have industrial, agricultural sheds to store their rarest stuff. Stuff that there might be 3, 4 of those left in the world, if that. And they have security because it's valuable. But also the other stuff that they have that's maybe 40 or 50 pieces of rare but not really rare, they might have them outside. One guy in Minnesota, good friend of mine, you can walk through it like a park. You go out to Shattuck, Oklahoma, they have a windmill park out there, same thing. You go down to the Lubbock, Texas is where it's located, but the American Windmill Museum is down there. They're also another facility dedicated, I should say, to windmills. But it's not an easy battle. It's not like baseball cards or books that you could just buy a ton of bookshelves and just put them in rooms and stacks and you could have thousands of them in that way. It's a labor of love. It's also one of these things where, I don't know if anybody's been to an auction, I'm sure we have, but windmillers are intense people when it comes to stuff they want. Not mean, intense. You get into an auction situation for rare pieces, there's one that comes to mind immediately. It's called a twin wheel. 2 wheels, 1 tower. If you had one of those in your collection right now, mounds and mounds and mounds of money, mountains of it. It's very rare. They made less than 100 of those. It was a government special project for commercial swampland. Go put 3 or 4 of those twin wheels in there, and because of their size, I mean, they're pumping a tremendous amount of volume past an average farm windmill. So technically, they weren't even really created for farms. They were created for commercial advancement. But they only made them in 2 places in the world, Hutchinson, Kansas, and Peoria, Illinois. So when you start looking at the big stuff, the twin wheels, the power mills, stuff that's 40, 30, 25 foot in diameter, it's a little rarer in the world because collectors are storing it and maybe you don't know them. But in my experience, in the last 10 years, I've talked with as many of those people as I know and I can find. And there's a big effort to try to get their story on camera for you. It might not be a Kregel Windmill Museum like our place that I'm honored to be the director of. And our history is deep. But their history is too, and the history of windmills is as well. I hope that answers your question.
Let's say a 60-foot tower with 10-foot blades. About how many gallons per pump would you get out of the ground?
That's a good question I can't answer off the top of my head. It really depends on wind speed, and it depends on revolutions per hour, or I should say gallons per hour. I'm not a master level hydrologist or water science person, but I know enough to be dangerous. I try to keep it at a conversation level, that way I don't confuse people or say something incorrectly. But these water scientists, if you will, they look at windmills as gallons per hour. Some windmills might have 700 gallons per hour. Some might have 300. Some might have 50. But then we get back to the idiosyncrasies of what makes an air motor, a Dempster, an Eli, a Red, a Flint & Wally, an Ironman, or all these other brands, I could go on forever, different than the last. Air motors and Dempsters, for example, to get to the more technical side of your question, they're heavy mills. They're made with a heavier gauge of steel. Typically, you need stronger winds to make one full turn. An Eli windmill, for example, is a 3-to-1 ratio. It takes 3 turns. No, I have that backwards. An air motor windmill is a 3-to-1. 3 turns, 1 full pump, or what we call roughly about a gallon. because of the depth of the well and how you have to bring it up out of the hole. When you look at an Eli, one of the things that people ask, what makes an Eli different than the rest? Well, it was special. It's pumping almost 3 times more water in 1 hour than most mills made because it was much, much lighter than most mills. But it was made in such a durable way that it didn't break because there was less parts there. I wish I could buy a car that had less parts for an economy price that outperformed Ferraris and other high-end cars that would last forever. In this case, the Kregel family making their Eli windmills, that was the case. But there is a very specific science behind it. And that's why when people call me and they'll say, I want a windmill. You're the guy, help me, is usually the gist of the conversation. I'll say, all right, come on in, or let's do a Zoom call. But first questions I have to set the tone of our conversation helps me to go broker something or have a better understanding of how to explain to you is, do you want it to be demonstrational, collector, or do you want it to actually be what we call utility? It pumps water out of the ground for a garden or cows or maybe your farm field, whatever you need it for. And it's about, there's a lot of people that want a working windmill nowadays, just as much as people that like windmills. They have disposable income and they want to buy one and they want to know how to do that. So I know that doesn't directly answer your question, but there are several factors behind what gets more water and the why.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There were other manufacturers in Nebraska, right?
Great question. So one of the things that I really stress with the Nebraska State Fair leadership out at Fauner Park, Grand Island, as you guys probably already know, there were 3 big Nebraska manufacturers. That does not mean that all 3 of these manufacturers originated in our state. The Kregel family, or the Kregel Windmill factory, did. But Dempster was easily the second biggest brand making windmills in Nebraska. There was a facility in Beatrice until recently. There was a bit of a fire, that's another story. But that facility has been sitting there for years. I think it closed in the early 2000s. Fun fact, the state of California ordered a little over 2 million Dempster water pumps from that facility out of Beatrice. So sometimes when I get into conversations with people all around the country about, I collect water pumps. How can I get this particular Dempster 4 or Dempster 7 or a 9? Because everybody always wants one of everything, typically. I'll say, well, you need to get into some chat rooms and some windmill restoration groups out in California because they have them. And so sometimes you actually find Nebraska relics in other states. Case in point, the last company to be kind of a big 3 in Nebraska, the Fairbury Windmill Company, Fairbury, Nebraska. They closed down in 1963, I believe. It's an interesting thing because in the late 50s, the ownership and the leadership of Kregel, the leadership of Dempster over here in Beatrice, and then the leadership of the Fairbury Windmill Company, they all have a big lunch. And they are competitors at the time. They're friendly, but they all own businesses and they're competing. So it's actually George Kregel that says to, I forget the fellow's name who ran Dempster at the time, we need to partner. Because otherwise, the next one's going to drive out the next one. There's going to be one company left standing, and if we partner, we can corner the whole Midwest. We can literally dominate the Nebraska market and all the states around us, and then build from there. Sky's the limit. So Dempster and the Kregels did this. And they had a partnership where they worked on each other's stuff. Maybe you had a Eli in Beatrice, Gage County. Take it to Dempster. You don't have to haul it to the Kregels. And vice versa in the Odo County, Nebraska City area for Dempster's going to Kregel. They made a lot of money together when you go look at the Kregel records. Fairbury Company said no. And then they go under a few years later. So I often think that maybe if they would have partnered with Kregel and the Dempster Company, they might still be making windmills today, or they might have lasted maybe longer per se in a partnership situation. But those were the 3 big ones in Nebraska. The last brand that you find heavy out in the wild, as I call it, it's actually called a Challenge. Good windmill, not made here, but it was made in other states next to us, so they're here in volume as well.
Great, thank you today. Thank you.